The process of carrying out a systematic review is outlined as follows and will be demonstrated via excerpts from a systematic review entitled Exercise for Osteoarthritis of the Knee. First, the researcher must clearly define the objective of the study or define the research question we are seeking to answer. Here, the researcher defines who the study participants are, what interventions are under investigation, what outcomes are to be assessed, and the setting of the studies under review. Once established, the researcher specifies the eligibility criteria, also known as selection criteria, that will be used to determine which studies to include in their review. Selection criteria for systematic reviews may include the study population, treatments, outcomes, length of follow-up, and aspects related to study design or methodological quality. Clearly stating the objectives and eligibility criteria up front and sticking to the predetermined plan is one way to mitigate the potential for bias. The next step is finding or locating studies, that is, conducting a literature review. This involves deciding on which information sources to draw from, including published and unpublished literature. Will the researcher retrieve sources from specific databases, reference lists of retrieved articles, journals that do not have online access, trial registries, conference proceedings, and unpublished trials? A search strategy is identified and usually begins with identifying which health-related databases to use, for example, PubMed, Embase, and Medline, and what keywords and terms will be inputted and combined into the database's search engine. After this preliminary search, the researcher may also use other methods to ensure they have considered all possible research related to the topic. Being as comprehensive as possible in the search helps to mitigate the effects of publication bias. Publication bias occurs because studies with positive results are more likely to be published than negative trials. Studies with positive results are also more likely to be published quickly and in prominent English language journals compared to negative trials. This may lead to overestimation of treatment effects when pooling the effects of multiple studies in a systematic review. Publication bias can be mitigated through a comprehensive search strategy, including unpublished literature, foreign language journals, and conference proceedings and abstracts. Next, one or more reviewers select studies by applying the predetermined selection criteria to all the titles and abstracts that are identified in the search. The initial database search may yield thousands of titles and abstracts to review and ultimately narrow down to those that meet the criteria. Each reviewer will enter the pre-established search terms and independently review the exact same set of titles and abstracts, identifying relevant articles for further full-text review. The reviewers will meticulously track whether they have flagged an article for further follow-up or deemed it ineligible for further review. At the end of this process, the researchers cross-reference their selections and assess the agreement between included titles and abstracts. Ideally, each reviewer will have selected the same titles and abstracts for inclusion. However, perfect agreement is seldom achieved. A third independent reviewer may serve to adjudicate on decisions regarding discrepancies between reviewers. Now that the titles and abstracts have been identified for closer review, the same process is repeated, with each reviewer independently examining the full text of these studies, assessing their eligibility for inclusion, and resolving any discrepancies with a third-party reviewer. Once the final eligible articles have been selected and agreed upon, the researchers should assess the methodological quality of each study. This is an important step as consistent results among studies that are considered methodologically weak are less compelling than consistent results in strong studies. We may also conduct analyses on different groups of studies, termed subgroup analyses, separating studies by quality rating to see if this has any impact on findings. Typically, less rigorous studies tend to overestimate the effectiveness of interventions. So how do we assess the methodological quality of our studies? In systematic reviews, researchers often use risk of bias tools or pre-existing scales that assign studies a score to measure methodological quality. However, these quality ratings can vary depending on the scale used, and a standardized tool may not be an ideal method compared to judicious and thoughtful consideration of factors for each study. Factors to consider for randomized trials include: were patients randomized appropriately? Was allocation concealment achieved? Were patients in treatment and control groups balanced for known prognostic factors? Were the appropriate people blinded? Was intention to treat employed in the analysis? Was follow-up complete? Notice that this excerpt assesses the following criteria: random sequence generation, allocation concealment, blinding, completeness of follow-up, and selective outcome reporting. These are all relevant areas to assess the potential for bias in randomized trials. The researcher then describes and compiles the results, thus conducting the analysis. This step involves extracting the data from individual studies to be included in the review. Typically, this will include the reference, the setting and sample, the intervention and how it is measured, the health outcome and how it is measured, and a measure of the size of the effect with associated confidence intervals. Typically, the first step of the descriptive results will include a summary of how many studies were screened or included at each stage of the review process. Next, the attributes of studies are summarized, describing the main features of the study and key findings. Finally, a descriptive narrative is written regarding the key findings, considering all of the studies. In some cases, the final step of analysis may be performing a meta-analysis by combining the results of several studies. Meta-analysis is the pooling and statistical analysis of data from studies included in a systematic review.